A millionaire CEO is challenged by a food delivery worker and falls head over heels in love. Before we dive into the story, leave a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. Charlotte Hayes pedaled as if her life depended on it because, in a way, it did. Her shift at Metro Eats, a local delivery service, was almost over. But this last order was taking longer than expected. Come on, she muttered, swerving around a distracted pedestrian walking at a snail's pace while glued to his phone. Finally, she reached Morgan & Blake LLP, a law firm so exclusive that even the receptionist looked like she had stepped out of a luxury perfume commercial. As soon as the elevator doors opened, a group of lawyers rushed in, deeply engaged in conversation about an important meeting. Probably something about multi-million-dollar contracts. Not about making ends meet like Charlotte. She hurried in right behind them, slipping through the closing doors like a delivery ninja. Perfect, she whispered to herself. But then another man stepped in. He had an air of authority, a flawless suit, and perfectly styled hair. At that exact moment, the elevator let out a loud, shrill beep beep beep. One of the lawyers checked the digital panel and widened his eyes. We've hit the weight limit. The group exchanged glances. One of them turned directly to Charlotte. Someone needs to step out. Charlotte blinked. Okay, who was the last one to get in? She looked straight at the impeccably dressed man. It was him. The man raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised at being called out so bluntly. Me? Yes. If someone has to leave, it should be the last person who got in. Basic elevator etiquette. Good point, a lawyer murmured beside him. But before the man in the suit could step out, he crossed his arms. I'm not leaving. I need to get upstairs. Charlotte crossed her arms too. Great. So do I. And my delivery is just as important as your meeting. The lawyers exchanged awkward glances, unsure of what to do. Miss, please just take the next one. It's only a few minutes. A few minutes could cost me my delivery. You're serious? Yes. Why should I be the one to leave and not him? She pointed at the man in the suit again. He now had a slight smirk, as if he was actually enjoying this. Because he's Ethan Calloway, the CEO of this firm. Charlotte blinked. So what? CEOs can wait too, right? Silence. Then, Ethan smiled, looking straight at her. You've got guts. I've got a delivery to make. And I have a company to run. The lawyers sighed in frustration. Finally, one of them stepped out. There. Now stop arguing. The doors closed and the elevator started moving. Charlotte glanced at Ethan. I bet you got your CEO title by arguing with people until they gave up. And I bet you'd make a great lawyer. Charlotte scoffed. Why does everyone keep saying that? On the 28th floor, the lawyers exited first, ignoring Charlotte completely. Ethan headed straight for his office while Charlotte went to drop off the order. When she checked the recipient's name, she froze. No. She took a deep breath, hoping it was just a system error. But it wasn't. She knocked on the door, already preparing herself for the awkward conversation ahead. Ethan looked up, genuinely surprised to see her. You again? Charlotte forced a smile so stiff it could be considered fraudulent. Yep. Life's little ironies. Here's your food, Mr. CEO who can't wait for an elevator. She placed the bag on his desk with just a little more force than necessary. Ethan held back a laugh. Looks like we were meant to cross paths more than once today. Or maybe I've been cursed by the god of bad luck. He picked up the bag and studied her for a moment. You're a great speaker. Have you ever thought about doing something other than food delivery? Charlotte narrowed her eyes. Why does everyone keep saying that? Because you're quick-witted, sharp, and incredibly bold. That's rare. I studied law for a bit, but I had to drop out. Why? She looked away. Personal reasons. She crossed her arms. Look, if you're about to give me some motivational speech, I'll pass. Ethan chuckled. Not at all. He grabbed a piece of paper, scribbled something, and slid it across the desk. This is a mock case. An employee was fired without cause. How can they fight it? Charlotte picked up the paper and read it. Seriously? You're testing me now? I'm curious. Charlotte rolled her eyes. But she couldn't resist the challenge. It depends on the contract and the length of service. If the termination was without prior notice, they may be entitled to compensation according to labor law. If there's a specific clause in the contract, they could claim a breach of agreement. Ethan watched her, a glint in his eyes. You have talent. Charlotte frowned. Was that a test? It was. And you passed. She huffed. Great. Can I go now? Ethan grabbed her insulated food bag before she could stand up. If you want a better job than delivering food, come to my office tomorrow. Let's talk. Charlotte raised an eyebrow. Are you offering me a job? I'm offering you a chance. What you do with it is up to you. Charlotte took his card and left without a word. Ethan watched her go, a curious smile on his lips. That girl wasn't ordinary, and he wanted to find out exactly what she was capable of. Charlotte wasn't sure what was worse, the fact that she had been tested without warning, or the fact that somehow she had passed. After leaving Morgan and Blake LLP, she looked at Ethan's business card, as if it were a winning lottery ticket, only instead of millions. The prize was a mysterious job working alongside a demanding CEO. She sighed. If I keep going at this pace, I'll end up signing a contract without reading the fine print. When she got home, Mia, her roommate, was already on the couch munching on popcorn and watching a reality show. So, how was your battle with the lawyers? Charlotte flopped into the armchair. I got fired, argued with the CEO, and now he's offering me a job. Mia's eyes widened. Wait, the guy from the elevator? The one and only? Mia blinked, then clicked her tongue. If this were a cliché romance, you two would be married by the end of the year. Charlotte grabbed a pillow and threw it at her friend. This is real life, Mia. I just want to pay my bills. And what are you going to do? Charlotte looked at Ethan's card again. Took a deep breath. I think I'll go. I've got nothing to lose. Charlotte took a deep breath before stepping into the building again. This time, no food bag, no delivery uniform, no smell of takeout. She was dressed as professionally as her budget allowed. A light blue blouse, black pants, and a pair of shoes that would probably give her blisters if she walked too much. The receptionist recognized her immediately. You again? Charlotte smiled. No crowded elevators this time. The woman chuckled and picked up the phone. Mr. Calloway, your guest is here. After a brief pause, she nodded. You can go up. Charlotte headed straight to Ethan's office. This time, when the elevator doors opened, no one told her to leave. When she entered, Ethan was sitting behind his desk. As if he had already known she would come. He smiled when he saw her. Welcome to the office, Charlotte. I haven't accepted anything yet. Then why are you here? Charlotte crossed her arms. Curiosity. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Great. Then have a seat. She hesitated, but eventually she sat in the chair across from him. Ethan took a file and placed it on the desk. Here's your first challenge. Charlotte picked up the document and quickly skimmed through it. Wait, this is a real contract. Yes. And you want me to review it? And tell me if there's anything wrong. Charlotte narrowed her eyes. This still feels like a test. Ethan smiled. Of course it is. But that's how you'll learn. Charlotte huffed, but grabbed a pen and started reading. 3 minutes later, she was already marking up several clauses. Ethan watched, amusement hidden in his expression. Find anything? Charlotte looked up. If the contracting party fails to meet the deadline, the penalty fee will be determined at the contractor's discretion, based on what is most convenient. She looked at Ethan. That basically gives the contractor the right to charge whatever they want. Ethan nodded. And is that legal? Charlotte smirked. Legal? Yes. Ethical? Not at all. Ethan let out a small chuckle. I like the way you think. Charlotte crossed her arms. So, did I pass the second test? Ethan stood up and extended his hand. If you accept the job, this will be your daily routine. Charlotte hesitated for a second. Then, she shook his hand. I accept. But no coffee runs. Ethan smiled. We'll see. Charlotte was introduced to the office as Ethan's new assistant. And the murmurs started immediately. Is that the girl from the elevator? Yeah. He actually hired her. But she was a delivery girl? Charlotte rolled her eyes. Great. Her nickname was already set. Lena, Ethan's secretary, smiled at her. Don't worry. They'll forget in a few weeks. Charlotte sighed. Or remember forever. Lena laughed. Come on. I'll show you where you'll be working. Charlotte was led to a desk near Ethan's. Here's your space. You can start by organizing these files. Charlotte looked at the stack of papers. Is this a punishment? No. This is a normal day. Charlotte sighed, and started reading the documents. 15 minutes later, she had already found 2 serious mistakes. She picked up a pen and began marking the inconsistencies. Ethan walked by and stopped when he saw her notes. You've already found errors? Charlotte looked up. If I'm going to be fired for correcting bad contracts, just let me know now. Ethan laughed. Relax. You're doing exactly what I expected. Charlotte let out a breath of relief. Great, because I'm already halfway through the second contract. Ethan watched Impressed. At this pace, she'll be giving me orders soon. Charlotte smirked. Don't doubt it. But she quickly realized, not everyone was happy with her presence there. Ryan Carter, a more experienced attorney, had been watching her with suspicion since she arrived. At lunchtime, he finally decided to confront her. You know you don't deserve to be here, right? Charlotte raised an eyebrow. Oh? And who decides that? You. I studied for years to be here. You were delivering food last week. Charlotte smiled. And yet Ethan hired me. What does that say about you? Ryan turned red. Let's see how long you last. Charlotte tilted her head. If you want to bet, I'm in. At that moment, Ethan appeared. If you're done with this ego contest, we have a client waiting. Charlotte followed Ethan, a victorious smile on her face. Ryan stayed behind, clearly frustrated. But Charlotte knew this was just the first of many battles in that office. Charlotte was still trying to wrap her head around the fact that just a week ago she was delivering food. And now she was the personal assistant to the CEO of one of the most prestigious law firms in Chicago. If someone had told her this would happen, she would have laughed in their face. But there she was, sitting at her new desk, reviewing contracts, while receiving judgmental looks from attorneys who were clearly unhappy with her presence. She didn't care. Well, actually she did. A little. But she would never show it. Ethan walked past her desk with a folder in his hand. Have you finished the contracts I gave you? Charlotte picked up a stack of papers. If you want me to review them in the dark and with my eyes closed, I can pretend I have. He laughed. Take this folder. We have a meeting with an important client in 10 minutes. Charlotte's eyes widened. Wait, I'm going to a meeting? Ethan shrugged. If you want to learn, you need to see how things work in practice. She grabbed the folder, straightened her posture, and followed him down the hallway. It was funny how, even though she wasn't a lawyer, she felt like she belonged there more than some of the people who were looking down on her. When they entered the meeting room, they found a middle-aged man in a dark suit, sitting with a serious expression. He looked at Ethan, then at Charlotte, clearly surprised. Who is this? Ethan sat down and gestured for Charlotte to do the same. My assistant, Charlotte Hayes. The man frowned. Assistant? I was expecting someone more experienced. Charlotte smiled and crossed her arms. Funny. I was expecting more polite clients. Ethan suppressed a laugh, while the man's eyes widened. What? She opened the folder and slid a contract toward him. Let's get straight to the point, Mr. Martinez. You want to renegotiate the termination clause in your company's contract, correct? The man narrowed his eyes, clearly suspicious. Yes. Charlotte gave a patient smile. The problem is, if you do it the way you suggested, you'll be opening the door for others to use the same argument against you. You don't want that, do you? The man stared at the document, his frown deepening. Ethan crossed his arms and looked at Charlotte with amusement. And what's the solution, Charlotte? She picked up a pen and circled a section of the contract. Adjust this part here, ensuring that any changes to the termination clause can only apply in specific, predefined situations. This prevents loopholes. Mr. Martinez looked at Ethan. Has she always been like this? Ethan smiled. Since day one. The man shook his head and let out a sigh. Well, I like someone who gets straight to the point. Let's move forward with this. Charlotte kept a neutral expression, but inside she wanted to celebrate her first meeting, and she had already solved a problem before it turned into a lawsuit. As they left the room, Ethan looked at her approvingly. If you keep this up, you'll end up taking my job. She shrugged. Don't worry. I'll let you keep the bigger office. He laughed. Come with me. We have something else to take care of. Charlotte followed him through the hallways to a large conference room, where several lawyers were engaged in a heated discussion. This won't work, one of them snapped. If we don't find a solution, our client will lose millions. Another shot back. Ethan stepped in, and the room fell silent. You all look lost. Ryan, who had already made it clear he didn't like Charlotte being there, stood up with an irritated look. We have a complex case and we're stuck. Ethan took a folder from one of the lawyers and tossed it onto the table. Let's see if my new assistant has an idea. All eyes turned to Charlotte, and she felt the weight of their expectations settle on her shoulders. She picked up the document and started reading quickly. The case involved a company trying to terminate a contract without paying the penalty fee, claiming there was a failure in the service provided. She looked up. Is there concrete proof of the failure? One of the lawyers responded. The company says there is, but the documents they provided aren't strong enough to prove it. Charlotte flipped through a few more pages. Then, she smiled. Here's your way out. Ryan crossed his arms. Let's see what the delivery girl has to say. Charlotte ignored his mocking tone. If the company wants to terminate the contract without paying the penalty, they need to prove there was a serious failure in the service. But in this case, since their documents aren't enough, we can argue that unilaterally canceling the contract without payment constitutes a breach of contract. Ethan smiled. Exactly. The lawyers exchanged glances, and even Ryan looked surprised. That could actually work. Ethan looked at Charlotte with a satisfied expression. Well done, Hayes. Charlotte crossed her arms and smirked. I'm just getting started. Once everyone had left, Ethan leaned against the table and studied Charlotte. You know you're making some people uncomfortable here, right? Charlotte rolled her eyes. Oh, you noticed? I thought they were loving my presence. He chuckled. You're good, Charlotte. Better than many here. But that also means some people will try to bring you down. She narrowed her eyes. Are you trying to scare me? No. I'm preparing you. She sighed. Don't worry. I've been through worse. Ethan watched her for a moment, before smiling. Good. Because I have a feeling things are about to get even more interesting around here. Charlotte grinned. Can't wait. She turned to leave. But Ethan called her back. Oh, one more thing. She stopped and looked at him. What? He tossed a folder to her. Your next challenge. And this time, I want you to present the solution directly to the client. Charlotte looked at the folder, then back at him. You really enjoy testing me, don't you? Ethan smiled. And you really enjoy surprising me. She held onto the folder and walked out of the room, feeling like this was just the beginning of something much bigger than she had imagined. Ethan watched her go, a smile on his face. This is going to be fun. Charlotte left Ethan's office feeling the weight of the folder he had given her. This was a new challenge, and she knew this test wasn't just about her technical skills. It was also about how she would handle the growing tension in the office. Since she had started working there, she had noticed the suspicious glances and the whispers in the hallways. Some thought she was a joke. Others saw her as a threat. She didn't care. Or at least, she tried not to. She sat at her desk and opened the folder, carefully reading through the documents. The case was a contractual dispute between a company and a supplier, claiming breach of contract. The company wanted to terminate the agreement without paying compensation, arguing that the supplier had missed deadlines. The problem? The contract wasn't as clear as it should have been, leaving loopholes that could favor either side. Charlotte took a deep breath. This wasn't going to be easy. She had to prepare her argument and present it directly to the client. That meant there was no room for mistakes. If she failed, she would be giving her critics exactly what they wanted, an excuse to say she didn't belong there. She spent the entire morning analyzing the contract, taking notes, cross-referencing information with other documents attached to the case. It wasn't just about understanding the law. It was about understanding how the words on paper could be used in favor of the client. Before she knew it, it was already lunchtime. She got up and headed to the office cafeteria, where a few tables were occupied by lawyers engaged in lively conversations. As soon as she walked in, she noticed the looks. Some ignored her completely, while others whispered to their colleagues. She grabbed a coffee and a sandwich, trying to ignore the murmurs around her. But then, Ryan's voice, clearly not a fan of hers, echoed through the room. So, is the office's rising star already preparing for her big disaster? Charlotte took a deep breath before turning to face him. Ryan was sitting with two other lawyers, who chuckled quietly. If by big disaster you mean the inevitable success of my work, then yes, I'm getting ready. His colleagues laughed, but Ryan kept his eyes fixed on her. Let's see if Ethan keeps protecting you after you make a major mistake. Charlotte took a sip of her coffee and smiled. Funny, Ryan. You seem very concerned about my career. Maybe you should focus on your own. Or are you afraid of being left behind? The laughter at his table stopped. Ryan looked at her, clearly irritated, but said nothing. Charlotte just smiled and walked away, feeling like she had won another small battle. Back at her desk, she spent the afternoon defining her argument. She knew she had found a strong approach to defend the client, but she needed to make sure everything was perfect. By the time she finished, it was nearly the end of the workday. She walked to Ethan's office, knocked on the door, and stepped inside. He looked up from his computer, and smiled. So, are you ready? Charlotte placed the folder on his desk. Yes. And I think the client will like what I've put together. Ethan picked up the papers and started reading. As he went through them, his smile grew. You pinpointed exactly where the weaknesses were. Strong argument. Charlotte crossed her arms. So, when's the meeting? Ethan checked his watch. Tomorrow morning. I hope you're prepared. She smirked. I always am. The next morning, Charlotte arrived at the office earlier than usual. She reviewed her materials one last time. Before heading to the conference room, Ethan was already there, along with the client, Mr. Wallace, a middle-aged businessman with a sharp gaze. Mr. Wallace, this is Charlotte Hayes, my assistant, Ethan introduced her. The man frowned. Assistant? I was expecting someone more experienced. Charlotte held back a smile. She was used to this kind of reaction. I understand, Mr. Wallace, but by the end of this meeting, you'll be glad I'm here. He seemed intrigued, but nodded. Charlotte opened her folder and began her presentation. She calmly explained the contract's weak points, highlighted flaws in the supplier's arguments, and proposed a strategy that would put Mr. Wallace's company in a strong position, without violating any clauses. When she finished, the client remained silent for a few moments, studying the papers in front of him. Finally, he smiled. Impressive. You've got talent, young lady. Ethan smiled. Told you she was good. Charlotte maintained her professional demeanor, but inside she felt a wave of satisfaction. She knew she had done a great job. Mr. Wallace stood up and extended his hand. I'm convinced. Let's move forward with this strategy. Charlotte shook his hand firmly. Great choice. When the meeting ended, Ethan waited until everyone had left, before turning to Charlotte with a satisfied smile. You really enjoy surprising people, don't you? She shrugged. I just do my job. He looked at her for a moment, then nodded. Keep it up, Hayes. Charlotte walked out of the room feeling accomplished. But she knew this was only the beginning. If she really wanted to establish herself there, she would have to keep proving her worth every single day. And that's exactly what she intended to do. Back at her desk, Charlotte was still feeling the afterglow of her first big win, until an email popped up on her screen. It was a meeting request. Subject, Team Performance Evaluation. Charlotte frowned. Lena, she called over. Is this normal? Lena glanced at the screen and sighed. Not exactly. Evaluations happen, but they're usually one-on-one with supervisors. A group meeting like this? Seems suspicious. Charlotte immediately knew this wasn't just a routine evaluation. It was likely Ryan or another lawyer trying to put her on the spot. Just as she was about to close her laptop, Ethan appeared beside her desk. I saw you got called into the meeting. Charlotte nodded. Any idea what they're up to? Ethan crossed his arms. I have a pretty good guess. They're trying to make it look like hiring you was a mistake. Charlotte took a deep breath. And do you think they'll succeed? Ethan smiled. No. Because they still don't know who they're dealing with. Charlotte smirked. I like that confidence. At 3 p.m., Charlotte walked into the conference room. As expected, the room was full. Ethan was sitting calmly in the corner, while Ryan stood beside Mr. Barnes and other senior lawyers who seemed eager for the show. Barnes cleared his throat. We're here to discuss team performance and how we can improve internal processes at the firm. Charlotte knew that was just an excuse to get to her. Ryan was the first to speak. I think we should talk about hiring assistants without proper credentials. Silence fell over the room. Charlotte raised an eyebrow and looked straight at him. Are you talking about me, Ryan? He smirked. If the shoe fits. Charlotte chuckled. Interesting. Because I could say the same about lawyers who lose cases due to poor argumentation. Ryan frowned. What are you talking about? Charlotte pulled out a document, the one Ethan had given her, and slid it across the table. This case. Your client lost because you failed to properly contest the contract termination. Ryan picked up the file, his face turning red. This has nothing to do with this meeting. Charlotte smiled. Oh, but it does. Because you're questioning my place here. While you have a history of mistakes that cost our clients money. Barnes cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable. Ryan, do you have anything to say about this case? Ryan swallowed hard. It was a small mistake. Charlotte raised an eyebrow. Small? The client lost thousands of dollars. If it were me, I would have spotted the loophole in the contract before the deal was signed. Ethan remained silent, but the amused glint in his eyes showed. He was enjoying this. Barnes sighed. I think we can conclude that Miss Hayes is making a valuable contribution to the firm. This meeting is adjourned. Ryan's expression darkened, but he had no choice but to accept it. As everyone left the room, Ethan approached Charlotte. You played that well. Charlotte smiled. You gave me the cards. He shrugged. And you knew exactly when to use them. She glanced at Ryan as he stormed out, slamming the door behind him. I don't think he's going to give up that easily. Ethan grinned. Even better for us. The more they try to take you down now, the stronger you'll become. Charlotte took a deep breath. And I do love a good challenge. She knew this battle was just beginning. But one thing was certain now. She wasn't just some delivery girl. She was here to stay. And no one was going to stop her. Charlotte felt that something was about to happen. Ever since she had dismantled Ryan's attempt to discredit her, the stares in the office had become even more intense. By now she was certain some lawyers were just waiting for the slightest mistake, so they could use it as an excuse to take her down. But if they thought she was the type to back down under pressure, they were very mistaken. That morning, as soon as she entered the office, Lena approached her. With a worried look, I just heard something strange. Charlotte raised an eyebrow. As in? Lena glanced around, lowered her voice. Ryan is up to something. He wants to use the next negotiation meeting with an important client to expose you. Charlotte smirked. Of course he does. But what's his plan? Lena sighed. It looks like he's planning to put you on the spot during the meeting, hoping you'll make a mistake in front of the client. Charlotte took a sip of her coffee, looking completely unfazed. Then he's in for a surprise. Lena blinked. You seem really calm. Charlotte chuckled. He wants me to fail? Well, I'm going to shine. Ethan appeared at the door, holding a folder. Hayes, we have a meeting in an hour. I want you to lead the contractual part. Charlotte smiled. Consider it done. Ethan looked at her for a moment, and a slow smile appeared on his lips. I knew I'd like having you here. An hour later, Charlotte walked into the conference room. Ethan was already seated beside the client, Mr. Allen, the owner of a major tech company, closing a contract with a key supplier. Across the table sat the supplier's lawyers, and of course, Ryan, who looked far too pleased with himself. Charlotte took a seat next to Ethan and opened her folder. Shall we begin? Mr. Callahan, the supplier's lead lawyer, looked at Ethan, then at Charlotte. She's leading the negotiation? Ethan nodded. Trust me, she's the best person for the job. Ryan smirked, clearly waiting for Charlotte to make a mistake. Let's see how the firm's new rising star does. Charlotte ignored his tone and looked directly at the supplier's lawyers. We've reviewed the contract and identified a few points that need to be adjusted before we proceed. She picked up one of the documents, circled a paragraph with her pen. This clause here is ambiguous and could lead to unnecessary disputes. If we leave it as is, both parties might interpret it differently if something goes wrong in the future. The supplier's lawyers exchanged glances. Mr. Callahan leaned forward. What do you suggest? Charlotte turned the page, pointed to the revised section. We adjusted the wording to ensure that any changes to the contract scope must be formally documented and signed by both parties. This prevents disputes and ensures greater transparency. Mr. Allen reviewed the document and nodded. That makes sense. Ryan leaned back in his chair. But the supplier may want flexibility to make changes without having to formalize every detail. Charlotte remained composed. That wouldn't be in our client's best interest. Too much flexibility could create loopholes for changes that weren't previously agreed upon. Ethan crossed his arms. Exactly. The supplier's lawyers murmured among themselves. The senior lawyer adjusted his glasses. We can agree to that adjustment, as long as the penalty clause is reduced by 10%. Charlotte gave a controlled smile. Reducing the penalty weakens the contract for our client. But we can find a middle ground. We keep the full penalty, but offer a longer grace period for adjustments, as long as they are communicated in advance. The supplier's lawyers reviewed the proposal. After a few moments, they nodded. That seems fair. Mr. Allen smiled. I like this approach. Let's move forward with it. Ryan's expression darkened. Charlotte looked at him and gave a small wink. Anything else you'd like to add, Ryan? He let out a frustrated sigh. Nothing. Ethan smiled. Then we have a deal. As the meeting ended, Ryan left the room without saying a word. Ethan turned to Charlotte, crossed his arms. I told you I'd like having you here. Charlotte smiled. And I told you I was going to shine. Ethan laughed. This war between you two is just beginning. Charlotte gathered her papers and walked out of the room, certain that she was bothering the right people, and that only motivated her even more. She knew the battle was far from over. But if Ryan and the others wanted to play a game, then a game they would have, and she was more than ready to win. Charlotte left the meeting, feeling like she had just won another battle. The furious look on Ryan's face was proof that he had tried to bring her down and failed miserably. But if life had taught her anything, it was that people like him never gave up after the first attempt. He would come back with something more elaborate, and she needed to be ready. As soon as she returned to her desk, Lena approached with a worried expression. Charlotte, I heard a rumor, and I think you should know about it. Charlotte crossed her arms. The kind that says the new girl doesn't belong here. Or the kind that says let's try to ruin her? Lena sighed. The second one. It looks like Ryan and a few other lawyers are setting up a plan to put you in a tough spot. Charlotte raised an eyebrow. Do they really think I'm that careless? They're counting on your confidence. Ryan wants you to feel secure enough, not to double-check a tiny detail. And by the time you realize it, it'll be too late. Charlotte let out a quiet laugh. So they want me to fall, because of my own arrogance? Lena nodded. Basically. Charlotte gave a calculated smile. Perfect. Because I already know exactly how to fight back. Lena blinked, surprised. You already have a plan? Not yet. But it's only a matter of time. If they think they're going to catch me off guard, they're going to regret it. Lena gave a half smile. I like your fighting spirit. And I like watching fools fall into their own traps. Charlotte spent the rest of the morning working. But she already knew. She had to stay one step ahead. If Ryan wanted her to sign a document with an error, the best move was to play along. She would wait for the right moment, to turn the tables. Later that afternoon, Ethan called her into his office. You know Ryan and his group are up to something, right? Charlotte dropped into the chair, crossed her legs. Know about it? I'm already waiting for their move. Ethan smirked. And what's your plan? Let them dangle the bait, and when they think they've caught me, I'll make sure they hang themselves with their own rope. Ethan chuckled. Should I start worrying about you? Charlotte shrugged. Only if you're on the wrong side of the story. He was silent for a moment, then nodded. Do what you need to do, but make sure that when the dust settles, Ryan has no choice but to accept that you're here to stay. Charlotte stood up and gave a small smirk. I always do. The next morning, the office felt strangely quiet. It was as if everyone was waiting for something to happen. Charlotte noticed it the moment she walked in, but pretended not to. She grabbed a coffee, went to her desk, as if it were just another ordinary day. Then, Lena appeared with an envelope in her hands. Ryan just sent this to you. Charlotte took the envelope, opened it, and pulled out the papers. She scanned through them quickly, and by the second paragraph, she had already spotted the trap. They had manipulated a clause in the contract, so that if signed as it was in, the client would unknowingly waive their right to financial compensation. The problem? The change was subtle, almost imperceptible to someone who wasn't paying close attention. They wanted her to sign without noticing, and when the mistake was exposed, she would be held responsible. Charlotte let out a deep sigh. They could at least be more creative. Lena widened her eyes. You spotted the mistake that fast? Easily, but I'm going to pretend I didn't. Let's see how far they take this. Lena grinned. So the game has officially started? It has. Charlotte grabbed a pen, pretended to review the contract, then scribbled a comment next to the altered clause. Obvious mistake. Clause 5.4 contradicts Article 12.2. Please review before sending for final signature. She folded the paper, handed it back to Lena. Give this back to Ryan. Lena laughed. I'd love to see his face when he reads this. If you have a hidden camera, let me know. Lena left to deliver the document. Charlotte got back to work. Less than 20 minutes later, Ryan appeared beside her desk. Can we talk? Charlotte looked up at him with a falsely innocent smile. Something wrong, Ryan? He pressed his lips together. You made a note on the contract. I think you misunderstood something. Charlotte blinked. Misunderstood? What do you mean? Ryan took a deep breath, trying to keep his patience. The clause you pointed out isn't wrong. Charlotte picked up the papers again, pretending to be confused. Oh well, you're right. I read it too quickly. But you know what's funny? I almost signed without noticing. Someone distracted could have easily missed it. Imagine that. Ryan crossed his arms. Do you think I'm trying to trick you? Charlotte smiled. Me? Of course not. But look, I think this clause could be reworded to avoid any misunderstandings. What do you think? He was silent for a moment. Then he picked up the papers and walked away without saying a word. Lena showed up right after. Trying not to laugh, Ryan walked out of here looking like he swallowed a lemon. Charlotte smiled. He'll think twice before trying something like that again. Lena sighed. You're handling this better than I expected. And honestly, I'm really enjoying watching it. Charlotte picked up a new contract. Started reviewing it. Stick around, because I'm sure there will be plenty more to watch. And she was right. Ryan might have failed this time, but he would definitely try again. The only difference was now he knew Charlotte wasn't someone easy to beat. She was a worthy opponent. And if he wanted to play, she would play. And she would win. Charlotte knew Ryan wouldn't give up so easily after the humiliation in the meeting and his failed attempt to get her to sign a flawed contract. He would definitely come up with something new. She just didn't know what. The morning at the office was busy. Ethan was out for an external meeting, which meant she'd have some peace. Or so she thought, as she sat down to review a new contract. Lena appeared beside her with a worried look. You won't believe what I just heard. Charlotte sighed, set her pen down. Let me guess. Ryan? Yes. He's telling everyone you made a mistake in Mr. Allen's case. Charlotte narrowed her eyes. What do you mean? Lena pulled up a chair, leaning in to whisper. He's spreading the word that your contract clause left the client vulnerable to a legal dispute. He says that if the rival company wants to, they can use it against Mr. Allen and demand a renegotiation. Charlotte chuckled. Interesting. Because if he had found an actual issue, he would have gone straight to Ethan instead of spreading rumors. Lena smiled. I know, but that doesn't mean he won't try something more serious. He wants to force you to defend yourself in front of everyone. Charlotte crossed her arms. Great. Then he's in for another surprise. A few minutes later, an email was sent to all the lawyers in the office. Subject, Callahan contract review, emergency meeting at 3 p.m. Attendance required for Charlotte Hayes. Lena's eyes widened. He wants to put you on the spot, in front of everyone. Charlotte took a sip of her coffee, calm as ever. Then let's see him try. At 3 p.m., Charlotte walked into the conference room. As expected, the room was full. Ethan had returned from his meeting, sitting calmly, while Ryan stood beside Mr. Barnes and other senior lawyers who seemed eager for the show. Barnes cleared his throat. We're here to discuss a concern raised by Mr. Ryan Carter regarding the review of Mr. Allen's contract. Ethan remained neutral. And what exactly is the concern? Ryan smiled smugly. The clause proposed by Hayes allows for an interpretative loophole that could be used against our client if the other party challenges it. This puts Mr. Allen at risk. Charlotte feigned surprise, picked up a document. Oh wow, that sounds terrible. Now tell me, Ryan, what exactly is this so-called loophole? Ryan grabbed a paper, pointed to a paragraph. Here. The fact that contractual changes need to be formally documented. If the other party refuses to put them in writing, but makes informal changes, they could argue they weren't bound to comply. Charlotte held back a smile. You're right. They could argue that. Ryan crossed his arms, feeling victorious. So you admit you made a mistake? Charlotte gave a calm smile. No. I admit that you didn't read the entire contract. The room went silent. Charlotte slid another document across the table. If you had read the section on contract amendments, you would have seen there's a clause requiring all changes to be formally documented, to be legally valid. This means the other party can't refuse to register the changes without invalidating the contract itself. Ryan's face froze. Ethan finally spoke. So the loophole he found, doesn't actually exist? Charlotte shrugged. Only in his imagination. The room buzzed with murmurs. Barnes grabbed the documents. Read through them quickly. Sighed. Well then, there's nothing to discuss. The contract was drafted correctly. Ryan clenched his fists and stood up. That doesn't mean there wasn't carelessness. Charlotte smiled. You're right. Because you clearly forgot to read the whole document. Ethan couldn't hold back his laughter. Barnes slammed the folder onto the table. Meeting adjourned. Ryan stormed out. While Charlotte calmly gathered her papers, Ethan walked over, with a smile on his face. You really enjoy making them furious, don't you? Charlotte blinked. Me? No way. Ethan shook his head. If you keep this up, they're going to start having nightmares about you. She laughed. I hope so. After the meeting, Charlotte returned to her desk. Lena was right behind her. Ryan's completely humiliated. But Charlotte, this isn't over. Charlotte nodded. I know. He's losing the game. And he's going to try something riskier. Lena glanced around, as if expecting Ryan to appear at any moment. Just be careful. Charlotte smirked. Always. A few hours later, New email from Ethan Calloway. Evans, I need you to review this contract by tomorrow morning. I trust your work. Charlotte opened the attachment, started reading, but as she went through the clauses, her expression changed. Something was wrong. She read it again, and again. Her stomach twisted. There was a mistake, but this time, it wasn't one of Ryan's tricks. It was real. And worse, Ethan had said he trusted her. She couldn't afford to make a mistake. The office was already emptier when Ethan appeared by her desk, watching her in silence for a few seconds. Still here? Charlotte didn't take her eyes off the paper. This is serious, Ethan. He pulled up a chair, sat next to her. Show me. Charlotte slid the contract over, pointed at the problematic clause. Here, depending on how this is interpreted, our client could be forced to pay massive settlements without even being at fault. Ethan read the clause carefully, his brow furrowing. Damn, this is worse than I thought. She nodded. What if we just remove this part? He shook his head. We can't. The client demanded this clause. They want protection against unexpected contract terminations. If we take it out, they won't accept the deal. Charlotte leaned back in her chair, thinking. Then we need to rewrite it. Ethan studied her, a subtle smile on his lips. You take this very seriously. She rolled her eyes. Isn't that the job? He chuckled. Yes, but it's rare to see someone who actually cares this much. Charlotte held back a smile. I'm not most people. Ethan tilted his head slightly, watching her. I know. The office was nearly empty. The soft glow of desk lamps, the only light left. Charlotte sat at her desk. Ethan sat across from her, both buried in paperwork, surrounded by notes, coffee cups, and revised versions of the contract. They had been working on the problematic clause for hours, until, okay, Charlotte said, scribbling something on the paper. What if we change this part here? This way, the client keeps their protection against terminations. But we make it clear, the clause can only be triggered under specific conditions. Ethan read the revision and smiled. That works. Charlotte let out a deep sigh, slumped back in her chair. Finally, Ethan laughed, leaning back beside her. You did well. She looked at him, exhaustion weighing on her. Thanks. But if you ever have another one of these bombs for me before 2 a.m., let me know in advance. Okay? He chuckled. I'll try. For a moment, they sat in silence, a comfortable quiet. Charlotte realized how close they were. Ethan seemed to notice too. His gaze lingered on her, more intense than usual. Charlotte cleared her throat and stood up quickly. Well, I guess we can submit this in the morning. Ethan blinked a few times, before smiling. Yes, we can. She grabbed her bag, trying to ignore the strange feeling in the air. All right then. See you tomorrow. Ethan nodded. See you tomorrow, Hayes. Charlotte walked out of the office, her heart beating faster than it should. That was strange. Very strange. But part of her couldn't stop thinking about the way Ethan had looked at her. And that scared her, more than any poorly written contract ever could. The next morning, Charlotte arrived at the office. Ethan was already in the meeting room, presenting the new version of the contract to the client. She slipped in quietly, sat beside him. Mr. Carter, the client, was carefully flipping through the pages. So you reworked this clause to give me better protection? Charlotte nodded. Exactly. This way your company won't be vulnerable to misinterpretation and will maintain contractual security. The man studied the document for a few more seconds. Then, he smiled. This is exactly what I needed. Ethan crossed his arms, looking satisfied. So can we move forward with the signing? The client picked up the pen. Signed without hesitation. Charlotte let out a quiet sigh of relief. Another problem solved. When the meeting was over, Ethan pulled her aside. You saved this contract, Hayes. She smiled. It was either that, or let our client lose millions. He looked at her, with an expression that suggested. He wanted to say something more. You really are different from anyone who's ever worked here. She raised an eyebrow. Different in a good way, or a bad way? He smiled. Very good. Charlotte blinked. Looked away. Well, I'm glad to hear that. Ethan held her gaze for a moment longer, as if debating whether to say something else. But then, he just smiled and left the room. Charlotte stood there, alone, trying to make sense of what was happening and why. For the first time since she started working there, she had no argument against what she was feeling. Lately, Charlotte couldn't stop thinking about the way Ethan looked at her. It was becoming a problem, not because it was uncomfortable, but because it was dangerous. She wasn't there to get distracted or to get involved with her boss. She was there to prove her worth, to silence Ryan and everyone else who doubted her. But Ethan was becoming a distraction that was hard to ignore. That morning, while grabbing coffee in the office kitchen, Lena appeared beside her, with a knowing smile. So, you and Ethan, what's going on? Charlotte nearly choked on her coffee. What? Lena laughed. Oh, come on. I saw the way he looked at you in the meeting yesterday, and I saw how fast you looked away. Charlotte huffed, trying to ignore the warmth creeping up her face. There's nothing going on. Lena raised an eyebrow. Right? So it's just my imagination, telling me there's chemistry between you two? Charlotte took a sip of her coffee. Sighed. I don't know what you think you saw, but I can't afford to even consider this right now. Lena crossed her arms. Well, maybe you don't want to think about it, but I think Ethan already is. Charlotte rolled her eyes and walked away before Lena could push her theory any further. But deep down, she couldn't shake the question. What if Lena was right? The day was hectic. Charlotte was deep into another major case when Ethan appeared by her desk. Can you come to my office? She looked up, nodded. Of course. When she walked in, Ethan closed the door behind her, leaned against his desk, arms crossed. I got an anonymous complaint. Charlotte frowned. A complaint about what? Ethan handed her a document. Charlotte took the paper, started reading. Her name was on it. Someone had sent a formal report, claiming she wasn't qualified to be at the firm, alleging she had been hired improperly and didn't meet company standards. She let out a humorless laugh. Seriously, this is their latest move? Ethan watched her closely. You know who did this? Charlotte took a deep breath. Ryan. It has to be him. Ethan nodded. I think so too. But don't worry. This won't go anywhere. Charlotte crossed her arms. Are you sure? He smiled. Do you really think I'd let that happen? She held his gaze for a moment. He was really willing to protect her. Thank you, she said, letting her guard down. Just a little. Ethan stepped a little closer. You don't have to thank me. I brought you here because I saw your potential. And nothing. No one is going to change that. Charlotte felt her heartbeat quicken. He was standing too close. She cleared her throat, looked away. Well, I should probably get back to work. Ethan held back a smile. Yes. But first, She looked at him. Suspicious. First what? He picked up a file from his desk, handed it to her. I need you to review this. But I want your honest opinion. Charlotte took the papers, raised an eyebrow. You've already read it? Yes. But I want to know what you think. She looked at the document, then back at him. You really trust my judgment that much? Ethan shrugged. So far, you've been flawless. Charlotte gripped the paper a little tighter. All right, I'll review it and get back to you. Ethan nodded. But before she turned to leave, he said, Hayes. She stopped, turned around. Yes. He smiled. You take everything so seriously. Just don't forget to breathe once in a while. She let out a small laugh. I'll try. And she left, not realizing She was still holding her breath. That afternoon, Charlotte carefully analyzed the document. It was an important contract. But what surprised her was Ethan genuinely wanted her opinion. He wasn't just testing her. He wanted her to have a voice. That meant more than she was willing to admit. When she finally finished it, she gathered her notes, walked to his office. Ethan was alone, reading a report. "Here it is," she said, handing him the papers. He took them, flipped through the pages, scanning her notes. "You found a mistake here," he pointed out. Charlotte nodded. "Yes, a subtle contradiction in the penalty clause." Ethan smiled. "Well done." She crossed her arms. "So, did I pass the test?" He looked up at her. "This wasn't a test. I genuinely wanted your input." Charlotte was silent for a moment. "Thank you." Ethan smiled. "No. Thank you." She realized he was looking at her again. That same way. That made her heart beat too fast. Charlotte cleared her throat, took a step back. "Well, if you need anything else, I'll be at my desk." Ethan nodded, but as soon as she left, he smiled to himself. Charlotte felt like she was stepping into dangerous territory. But for the first time, she wasn't sure if she wanted to step out of it. Charlotte was becoming more and more aware of Ethan's presence. Something between them was shifting, even if neither of them had the courage to admit it. But the office wasn't a place for distractions. And Ethan was too big of a distraction. That morning, she tried to focus on her work, tried to ignore his gaze whenever he walked past her desk, tried to ignore the tension that built up every time they were alone. But ignoring it was hard. When Ethan made sure to be around, "Hayes," his voice came from beside her. Charlotte closed her eyes for a second before turning to him. "What is it?" He was holding a folder and a coffee, as if he knew she hadn't had a decent one yet. "I need your help with a case." She took the coffee without hesitation. "Is this a bribe?" Ethan smiled. "Let's call it an incentive." Charlotte scoffed, but grabbed the folder and started flipping through the documents. "What's the case?" Ethan pulled up a chair, sat next to her. "The client wants to terminate a contract without paying a penalty, but the supplier is claiming breach of contract. We need to find a middle ground, so that no one gets hurt." Charlotte skimmed through the document quickly. "This isn't that complicated. There's a loophole here. If they argue the supplier delayed delivery, they can justify termination without a penalty." Ethan smiled. "You have an incredible talent for this." Charlotte rolled her eyes. "Don't praise me just yet. We need to see if this actually holds up in court." Ethan watched her, as if evaluating something beyond the case. "You're one of the most determined people I've ever met." Charlotte looked away. "And you're annoyingly observant." He laughed. "I'm a lawyer. It's part of the job." She sighed, grabbed a pen. "All right, let's get this done." But even as they worked, Charlotte could feel the tension in the air. And she knew it was getting harder and harder to ignore. That night, Charlotte stayed late at the office. So did Ethan. "You should go home," he said, leaning against her office door. Charlotte let out a sigh. "So should you." He gave a small smirk. "But I'm the boss." She laughed. "Does that mean you get to ignore common sense?" He stepped inside, sat across from her. "It means I can work late, without anyone questioning me." Charlotte crossed her arms. "Except me." Ethan studied her for a moment before saying, "Except you." The silence that followed was too intense. She glanced down at the papers on her desk. "I really need to finish this." "Charlotte." She froze. He rarely called her by her first name. Ethan seemed to be struggling with his words. "I." Before he could continue, his phone rang. He picked it up. His expression changed. "I have to take this." Charlotte nodded quickly, relieved by the interruption. But part of her knew that sooner or later, that conversation would happen. And she wasn't sure if she was ready for it. The next day, the office was buzzing with activity. Lena rushed to Charlotte's desk, looking frantic. "You won't believe this." Charlotte looked at her, exhausted. "What now?" "Ethan has a business dinner tonight with an important client." Charlotte took a sip of her coffee. "And?" Lena grinned. "Guess who he invited to join him?" Charlotte blinked. "Who?" Lena's grin widened. "You." Charlotte felt her stomach twist. "What?" "He said he wants you there. Said your presence is essential for the negotiation." Charlotte took a deep breath. "This isn't a date. It's just work." Lena laughed. Sure. Charlotte ignored her. Went back to work. But now, her heart was beating way too fast. And she didn't know if it was because of the dinner or because, for the first time, she couldn't see Ethan as just her boss. Charlotte spent the entire day trying to ignore the fact that she would be having dinner with Ethan that night. She kept telling herself, it was just work. But the way Lena looked at her, with that mischievous smile, made it clear. Not everyone saw it that way. When the time finally came, Charlotte went home to get ready. She chose a simple but elegant black dress, styled her hair in a neat way. She didn't want to look like she was trying too hard, but she also didn't want to be unprepared. When she arrived at the restaurant, Ethan was already there. He wore a perfectly tailored suit, as always, but he looked more relaxed than he did in the office. "Hayes," he said. When he saw her walk in, she crossed her arms. "Calloway." He smiled, clearly amused. "You can't relax for even a second, can you?" Charlotte sighed. "Not when I'm working with you." Ethan chuckled, leaned in slightly. "That means I'm doing a good job." Before Charlotte could respond, the client arrived. Mr. Harrington was an important businessman, negotiating a major contract with the firm. The dinner started formally, with discussions about business and contracts. Charlotte presented her arguments with confidence, making it clear she had studied every detail. Mr. Harrington seemed impressed. "You're very sharp, Miss Hayes." Charlotte smiled. "Thank you. I try my best." Ethan looked at her, with pride in his eyes. The dinner went smoothly, but at one point, when the client stepped away, Charlotte noticed Ethan watching her. In a different way. "What?" she asked. He hesitated for a second, before answering. "You surprise me more every day." Charlotte looked away. "I'm not sure if that's a good or bad thing." Ethan gave a small smile. "Definitely a good thing." She took a deep breath, feeling like this conversation was heading into dangerous territory. "Don't mix things up, Ethan." He raised an eyebrow. "And what exactly am I mixing up?" Charlotte narrowed her eyes. "You know." Ethan was silent for a moment, before sighing. "You always have an answer for everything, don't you?" She smirked. "It's my job." The dinner ended. The contract was practically sealed. Mr. Harrington left satisfied, leaving Charlotte and Ethan alone at the table. "Do you want me to drive you home?" he asked. Charlotte hesitated. "No need. I can go on my own." Ethan smiled. "I know you can, but that doesn't mean I can't offer." She looked at him for a moment, before finally sighing. "All right, on the way home." The silence in the car was heavy, until Ethan finally spoke. "You feel it, don't you?" Charlotte knew exactly what he was talking about, but she pretended not to understand. "Feel what?" Ethan glanced at her, before turning his eyes back to the road. "Whatever this is between us." She took a deep breath. "Ethan, don't tell me I'm imagining things." Charlotte stayed silent, because he wasn't. After a while, he just sighed. "Got it." She wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come out. When they reached her place, Charlotte got out of the car, without saying anything. But before going inside, she looked at Ethan one last time. He was still sitting there, watching her, with something unreadable in his eyes. And Charlotte knew that no matter how much she tried to avoid it, something between them had already changed forever. And the next day, nothing would be the same. Charlotte woke up the next morning, with a weight on her chest. The night before was still fresh in her mind, and no matter how much she tried to push it away, her conversation with Ethan kept replaying. "You feel it, don't you?" Yes, she did. But admitting it would be a point of no return. She didn't want to mix work with feelings. She couldn't. Ever since she started at the firm, she had to prove herself every single day, facing people like Ryan, showing everyone that her position wasn't a mistake. If Ethan got involved, everything would get even more complicated. When she arrived at the office, she tried to act normal, but Ethan was there too, and when their eyes met, it was clear. He hadn't forgotten their conversation. He walked over, speaking quietly. "Can we talk?" Charlotte hesitated. "I'm busy right now." "Then later." She sighed. "Ethan." He crossed his arms. "You can keep pretending nothing is happening, but I won't." A chill ran down Charlotte's spine. He never spoke like that. He always had a teasing remark, a smile on his face, a sharp comeback. But now, he was serious. Before she could answer, Lena rushed in. "Charlotte, we have a problem." Charlotte silently thanked the interruption. "What is it?" Lena hesitated. "Ryan." Charlotte's whole body went on high alert. "What did he do now?" Lena handed her a document. He filed a formal complaint against you with the board. He's claiming your hiring was irregular, and that you don't have the necessary qualifications for the job. Ethan grabbed the paper from Lena's hand, skimmed through it. His expression darkened. This is ridiculous. Charlotte crossed her arms. He really wants to take me down. Lena sighed. The problem is he got a meeting with Barnes to discuss it. Charlotte frowned. When? In an hour. She closed her eyes for a second, took a deep breath. Then let's settle this, once and for all. The meeting room was silent. Ryan sat at the head of the table, a smug smile on his face. All I'm asking is for Hayes' hiring to be reviewed. Mr. Barnes looked at Charlotte. What do you have to say about this? Charlotte crossed her arms. That this is nothing but a personal attack. Because I proved I'm better than him. Ryan laughed. Oh, sure. This has nothing to do with your questionable credentials. Ethan stepped in. If the issue is credentials, we can provide Hayes' academic records and her performance in the company. Charlotte slid a folder across the table. Here it is. Barnes opened the documents. Read through them quickly. The room was silent. Ryan was waiting for a response. Ethan was waiting for a response. Charlotte was waiting for a response. Finally, Barnes closed the folder, looked at Ryan. Your complaint is unfounded. Miss Hayes was hired on merit and has demonstrated more than enough competence for her position. There's nothing more to discuss. Charlotte smiled. Ryan, on the other hand, was furious. This is absurd. Barnes gave him a cold stare. What's absurd? Is you wasting the board's time with a baseless complaint. If you want to stay in this office, I suggest you focus on your own work. Ryan clenched his jaw, but he had no choice but to accept defeat. Ethan looked at Charlotte with a proud smile. I told you, no one was going to take you down. She took a deep breath. Thank you. Barnes stood up. This meeting is over. Charlotte gathered her documents, walked out, with Ethan by her side. When they reached the hallway, he gently grabbed her arm. Can we talk now? Charlotte looked at him. Ethan. He gave a small smile. You know, if you want to keep running from this, I can let it go. But I'm going to ask you one last time. She swallowed hard. Ask what? He took a step closer. And this time, Charlotte didn't back away. Do you feel this as much as I do? Charlotte stayed silent. But at that moment, she saw everything. Every time Ethan had supported her. Every glance they had exchanged. Every time her heart had beaten too fast. She could keep denying it. Or she could finally accept it. Charlotte took a deep breath. Looked at him. Yes. Ethan smiled. Finally. Charlotte rolled her eyes. You're impossible. He laughed. And before she could say anything else, he cupped her face and kissed her. It was as if everything around them disappeared. Charlotte had no idea where this would lead. But for the first time, she was willing to find out. Charlotte had never believed in fairy tales. She had always been used to fighting for everything on her own, protecting herself before anyone could hurt her. But there, in Ethan's arms, with his lips on hers, she realized she might have found something she never thought she would. He kissed her with an intensity that made her heart pound, as if all the tension between them was finally breaking free. When they pulled apart, Ethan rested his forehead against hers, a satisfied smile on his lips. I've waited a long time for this. Charlotte, still catching her breath, looked at him. And now that you have it? He held her face gently. Now I want more. She smiled, feeling lighter than ever. Then I guess we're on the same page. Ethan chuckled and kissed her again. This time, with no rush. The office could wait. The world could wait. At that moment, it was just the two of them. In the months that followed, their relationship evolved naturally. Ethan respected Charlotte's pace, never pressuring her. And little by little, she allowed herself to trust him. Of course, the entire office found out. I knew it. Lena practically exploded with joy, when she heard they were finally together. This office was begging for a power couple. Charlotte rolled her eyes, but laughed. Ryan, on the other hand, was furious. But after the humiliation he had suffered, he realized he no longer had the strength to fight them. Charlotte and Ethan worked together like an unbeatable team. And for the first time in a long time, Charlotte felt truly happy. But Ethan had a plan. He wanted more. Much more. On a quiet weekend, Ethan took Charlotte out for a special dinner. Any particular occasion? She asked, suspiciously. As they walked into an upscale restaurant, Ethan smirked. I just wanted to spoil you a little. Charlotte narrowed her eyes. You never do anything without a reason. He laughed. Blame it on my lawyer instincts. During dinner, Ethan seemed calmer than usual, but Charlotte could sense something in the air. Then, when the waiter brought dessert, a small envelope was placed next to her plate. What's this? Charlotte asked. Ethan just smiled. With slight hesitation, she opened the envelope and found a single sheet of paper inside. It was a legal document, but as she started reading, her heart raced. It was a marriage certificate, with their names on it. She looked at Ethan, stunned. What? He stood up, pulled a small box from his pocket, and got down on one knee. The entire restaurant went silent. Charlotte Hayes, he began, his eyes shining. From the day you walked into that elevator and argued with me, I knew you were different, but I didn't know you would completely change my life. Charlotte felt tears welling up in her eyes. You taught me to see the world in a new way, to truly care, and you made me realize that nothing is worth it if I can't share it with you. He opened the small box, revealing a stunning ring. So now, in the most cliché yet sincere way possible, will you marry me? Charlotte laughed, wiping her eyes. You really used a legal document to propose to me? Ethan smiled. I thought it was fitting. She looked at him, the man who had challenged her, who had believed in her when no one else did, who became her partner, both in and out of the office. And then, without hesitation, she answered, yes. Ethan laughed, slid the ring onto her finger, before kissing her, as the restaurant erupted in applause. At that moment, Charlotte knew that, for the first time in her life, she was exactly where she was meant to be. A few months later, their wedding day arrived. The ceremony was held in a beautiful garden. White flowers decorated the space, and a perfect blue sky stretched above them. Charlotte looked stunning in her white dress, holding a delicate bouquet. As she walked down the aisle, her eyes fixed on Ethan, who waited for her at the altar. With a loving smile, Lena, her maid of honor, whispered, I never thought I'd see Charlotte Hayes getting married. Charlotte laughed. Me neither. When she reached the altar, Ethan gently took her hands. The officiant began the ceremony, but Charlotte and Ethan barely heard a word. They were lost in each other. Charlotte, Ethan said during his vows, I never imagined that an argument in an elevator would lead me to you, but now, looking back, I see that it was the best thing that ever happened to me. You made me want to be a better man. And today, in front of everyone, I promise to keep challenging you, supporting you, and loving you for the rest of my life. Charlotte held back tears and smiled before saying her own vows. Ethan, she began, you are the most infuriating and charming person I have ever met. From the very beginning, you made me question everything, challenged me, and helped me grow. And now, I can't imagine my life without you. So today, in front of everyone, I promise, I will never argue with you in an elevator again. The guests laughed. So did Ethan. But I also promise that I will always stand by your side, no matter what. The officiant smiled. Ethan Calloway, do you take Charlotte Hayes as your wife? I do. Charlotte Hayes, do you take Ethan Calloway as your husband? She looked at him, her heart racing. I do. Then I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride. Ethan didn't wait. He pulled Charlotte into a passionate kiss, as the guests cheered. And in that moment, Charlotte knew she had found her place, her home, her love.